6, 1 to 9. Should be a verse you've heard before. This Bible opens this way. Deuteronomy is near the beginning. It is the 5th book of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And if you're ready, we'll read together. Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the ordinances that the Lord your God charged me to teach you to observe in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy, so that you and your children and your children's children may fear the Lord your God all the days of your life, and keep all his decrees and his commandments that I am commanding you, so that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and serve them diligently, so that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly in the land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has promised you. Hear, O Israel. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children, and talk about them when you're at home and when you're away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. This is the word of the Lord. Y'all remember that? We talked about last year at Valentine's Day. And hopefully last year at Valentine's Day wasn't the first time you've heard it either. The Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God, the Lord alone, and the bottom line is love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your, the Hebrew word is me'odcha, your a lot, all your muchness. Deuteronomy sits in context. And it is not a context which is entirely unlike the context that we are remembering today for Reformation Sunday. It's a really interesting book. It actually kind of sits in two contexts, right? So it sits at the end of the Torah, where the book of Numbers has just ended. A better word for the book of Numbers, because Numbers makes it sound boring, and it's not, is in the wilderness. That's what the Jewish people call it. Bamidbar, in the wilderness. This is the story of God's people after their Exodus, right? Second book, Exodus. So Genesis, we start. Exodus, we escape from Egypt. Leviticus, we just take a break. We talk about behind-the-scenes commentary for a while. Numbers, we're in the wilderness. And in the wilderness, God's people, they're in the wilderness a long time. It's 40 years. They get impatient. And they start to long to return to Egypt. They start to say, oh man, it was so great when we were slaves. You remember slavery? I want to go back to that. And Moses stands up before them, and he speaks. And he speaks words of reform. He tells them, listen, you are about to go through into the land, the promised land that the Lord your God is giving to you, and you haven't had the right attitude. You haven't been doing it right. And you need to do better. God is making you a promise. And in fact, the format of the whole book of Deuteronomy forms a contract. It's the same, grammar and the same basic literary structure as these treaties we find all over the ancient world. You know, when the Hittites conquer the Perizzites, they make the Perizzites sign this treaty that says, we, the Hittite Empire, are going to be your suzerain. We're we're going to take care of you, we're going to protect you, and in exchange, you're going to be our vassal. You're going to be obedient to us, subservient to us. You're not going to rise up arms against us and try to take us down. God does the same thing to Israel. In fact, in the first 5 chapters of Deuteronomy, Israel's trying to make those kinds of deals with other nations. They say no. And then God shows up and says, listen, here are my terms. I'm your God, nobody else. Love me with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And if you do, I'm going to give you multiplication in the land, prosperity, protection, long life. He actually does not say in the book of Deuteronomy eternal life. That comes later. But the Israel people are wanting, to still be a nation in a couple generations by the time our grandchildren are alive. And God says, I'm going to be your suzerain. You're going to be my vassal. How are those for terms? And that's really what we get at this Deuteronomy 6:4 passage. It's the thesis statement of a contract where God says, I'm in charge. What do you think of that? And since I'm in charge, you better get to follow me. You better follow my terms, or I'm going to withdraw that protection. I'm going to not be your suzerain anymore. Later in history, and you can read about it in 2 Kings chapter 22, you'll turn there together someday, they rediscovered this book. And once again, Israel has done what Israel does, and what indeed all of us do after a little while, just like we did after we escaped from Egypt. A couple decades passed, we forgot the Lord our God, turned from his ways. Israel did the same thing. They rediscovered this book and they said, this is an opportunity for reform. If we go back to loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, things will go well with us. That is what we need to do. And indeed, 1,500 years later, well, more like 2,000 years later, because this was about 500 BC that Josiah rediscovered this book, this guy named Martin Luther looked at God's people and he said, you know what we need? We need reform. We need to go back to basics. We need to go back to love. On Reformation Sunday, it is very traditional to talk about change. And since Reformation Sunday goes with Halloween, sometimes we talk about how change is scary. We talk about taking risks. We talk about liminality and liminal spaces, and maybe next year I'll talk to you about all those things. This year, I want to say to y'all, good job. We've successfully been pretty liminal. We've gone through some reforms together as a church through COVID and various other just upheavals and changes in our lives. And I want to focus on this second part of the verse. Well, really before and after the Shema, on both sides. So the Shema, we call it, Hear, O Israel. The word in Hebrew is Shema. So we call that whole prayer, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The Shema. That is worth memorizing. But before and afterwards, he says, teach you about the land you cross over and occupy, so that your children and your children's children may fear the Lord your God all the days of your life and keep all his commandments and decrees. And then afterwards again, recite them to your children and talk about them when you're at home and when you're away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them on your hand, put them on the doorpost of your house, tie a string around your finger to remind you, put an alarm on your phone. Don't forget. Love the Lord your God. Don't forget. Stick to this. And don't just stick to it for one lifetime. I need you to stick to it longer than that. I need you to keep remembering generation after generation after generation. Sometimes, rarely, in our lives, there comes a moment for reform. Sometimes there is a dramatic change in the tectonic plates of history, and an earthquake happens, and something big, there's a big moment when a lot of stuff changes very quickly. Usually, the way healthy change happens is with slow, consistent work. I like to use the phrase, a long obedience in the same direction. And I need that word for myself and the life I'm living right now, which is part of why I suspect that some of you need to hear that word this week and this month, this year. A long obedience in the same direction. You know what you got to do, but it's going to take longer than you want it to. You got to stick to it, and you got to keep going. I know you've been walking in the wilderness for a long time. I know you're tired. Keep following the Lord. That direction is the direction. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but some of you probably have gained some COVID weight. Right? There is some lockdown stuff that happens. There's stress, and that's associated with stress eating, and then there's just, you can't leave the house, you can't do the things, you can't go to, all the gyms were closed for a while. We gained some weight. How do you lose weight? A long obedience in the same direction. You don't do it by crash dieting. It's not going to work long term. You lose weight by making right choices every day for a long time. How do you build muscle, body build, get stronger? Long obedience in the same direction. We are, Tiffany and I, fixing up a house. We bought a house that's kind of a fixer. It just needs a lot of work. A long obedience in the same direction. Do one project a week, every week. For the next 20 years, we should be done. How do you build a church? How do you grow a church? When you look around and you see that there's not that many of us. You could worry about it, right? And you could say, we got to do something drastic. And sometimes that is appropriate. Sometimes doing something drastic is, mortgage the building, give it to AIDS relief in Africa, and maybe make headlines and something amazing happens. Oftentimes, if you want to multiply, I love that word, multiply. Multiply is so key for church growth. Not about add, it's about multiply. You don't get one person at a time who wants to join the thing we're doing, but you get the one person who brings two people, and each of them bring two people, and each of them bring two people, and then you start to, the graph goes parabolic. And if you want to multiply, God says the way you do that is you love the Lord your God with all your heart, and all your soul, and all your strength. And you don't forget for like 150 years. A long obedience in the same direction. Small, incremental improvements. I told you a couple of weeks ago that we were going to do something about the wires that were under the table. We got the wires under the table cleared out. Like, just these individual, we've got a new janitor, thanks to some work that the Arredondos that are doing, so that we can have a cleaner space. Hopefully sometime soon we will get a screen that is facing this way, so I can be looking that way and I don't have to turn around to see what you're looking at on the screen. These kinds of small changes, if we can do them healthfully, if we can do them decently and in order, if we can do them while enjoying each other's company and authentically wanting to be here and wanting to be together, it will feel like nothing's happening, and it will be what causes everything to happen. just like losing weight, a long obedience in the same direction. Doing the right thing because it's right, and doing it for a long time. That's our credo. That is our, and in fact, I've been giving long sermons lately. That's our credo. And you know what's a good thing to remember about credos? We've got a pretty important one. It's called the Apostles' Creed. So let's remember, as we think about being obedient to the same thing the apostles were obedient to, and saying together the answer to this question, friends, what do you believe?